North Korea has conducted nearly 24 missile tests this year, including ICBMs and cruise missiles, and has reportedly stopped its routine military-to-military communications with South Korea. And I understand it is the intelligence community's view that climate change will continue to exacerbate risks to U.S. national security as issues like rising temperatures, poor water governance, pollution, changing precipitation patterns, and other climate effects are likely to lead to an array of human challenges such as food and water insecurity and threats to human health. I would appreciate our witnesses' perspectives on each of these complex challenges. Thank you again for your participation, and I look forward to your testimony. As a reminder for my colleagues, there will be a closed session immediately following this hearing in room SVC 217. Now let me turn to the ranking member, Senator Wicker. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to congratulate you on your statements concerning the threat we see from China and Russia. And also I want to join you in observing and memorializing the life of General Vincent Stewart and his untimely death. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. It comes at a pivotal time. The United States is confronted with the most complex and dangerous global security environment since the Second World War. Our adversaries are growing in their military capabilities and engaging in provocative and destabilizing behavior across the spectrum of competition and conflict. They are actively trying to displace the United States as the global leader and weaken longstanding and critical alliances and partnerships. We are at an inflection point. The decisions we make this year will have far-reaching implications for the United States military, whether it is properly positioned and equipped to deter our adversaries and, if necessary, defeat them in conflict. Regrettably, the President's budget request lacks urgency this moment requires and fails to make the necessary investments in our nation's defense. For the third year in a row, the budget request cuts defense spending. Make no mistake, our adversaries are taking notice, and I do believe on a bipartisan basis we will rectify this failure. Our foremost adversary, the Chinese Communist Party, is in the midst of an unprecedented buildup of its conventional, strategic, and asymmetric military capabilities under the direction of its most powerful and ruthless leader since Chairman Mao. At the same time, Vladimir Putin's brutal and unprovoked attack against Ukraine has entered its second year and has upended global security, caused untold loss of life, and further isolated his autocratic regime. Now is not the time to question our commitment to Ukrainian partners. To protect U.S. interests, we need to provide Ukraine with the tools it needs to bring this war to a successful conclusion. Not to be outdone, North Korea may now possess enough missiles to overwhelm our homeland missile defenses, and Iran inches closer to developing a nuclear weapon of its own while it continues to sow chaos across the Middle East through its terrorist proxy network. Additionally, President Biden's disastrous and chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan has emboldened terrorist networks around the world. ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates across the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia are reconstituting their capabilities and remain intent on killing Americans. I remain deeply disturbed by the scope and severity of the recent disclosure of classified materials and the impact such disclosure has on military operations, intelligence collection, and cooperation with key allies. Although I understand multiple investigations are ongoing, I expect this committee will be kept fully informed and details become available and corrective actions are taken. This committee deserves answers on how such a junior service member in a support role was able to access, print, and post online highly classified documents for over a year without detection, for over a year. We need to understand whether the Department of Defense's insider threat and security procedures failed or simply were not followed. Again, I thank the witnesses for being here. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to a very important discussion.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Thank you very much for your statement. And let me now recognize Director Haynes.
Thank Thank you very much, Chairman Reed, Ranking Member.
Could you bring the microphone as close as possible?
Is that better?
Madam? That is.
Okay, good deal. Sorry about that. No, and thank you very much for your kind words about General Stewart, who really was just an extraordinary leader in the intelligence community and somebody who has inspired a lot of our folks over the years and brings together sort of integrity and skill in a way that's quite rare and extraordinary. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today alongside my wonderful colleague, General Berrier, and for your steadfast support for the men and women of the intelligence community who serve our country. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present the annual threat assessment and would just want to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to this work, from the collector to the analyst to everyone in between. This assessment is a product of their effort, and they have our gratitude. This year's report notes that during the coming year, the United States and its allies will face an international security environment dominated by two strategic challenges that intersect with each other and existing trends to intensify their national security implications. First, great powers, rising regional powers, and an evolving array of non-state actors are vying for influence and impact in the international system, including over the standards and rules that will shape the global order for decades to come. And second, challenges that transcend borders, including climate change, transnational criminal activity, health and human security, and economic needs made worse by energy and food insecurity, as well as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, are intensifying as the planet emerges from the COVID-19 pandemic. And further compounding this dynamic is the impact that rapidly emerging technologies are having on governance, economies, communities around the world. The intersection of these challenges underscore the importance of working together with partners and allies to address the threats we face, and how critical it is to counter efforts to undermine the global norms, principles, and mechanisms that promote and underpin transnational cooperation, which is an implicit theme in this year's threat assessment. The report starts with the People's Republic of China, as it is increasingly challenging the United States economically, technologically, politically, militarily, and from an intelligence standpoint around the world. And I'll spend most of my time on China and Russia, which are among our top priorities, and focus on updating our views with the latest rather than repeating what's in the annual threat assessment. We assess that the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, under President Xi Jinping, will continue efforts over the next year to achieve Xi's vision of making China the preeminent power in East Asia and a major power on the world stage. What is perhaps most concerning is that the CCP is increasingly convinced that it can only fulfill Xi's vision at the expense of U.S. power and influence, and through tools of coercion, using demonstrations of strength, as well as economic and political coercion to compel governments to acquiesce to the CCP's preferences, including the land, sea, and air claims in the region and its assertions of sovereignty over Taiwan. And the relationship between the United States and China has consequently become more challenging. Xi's public reference to America's suppression of China in March of this year reflects his longstanding distrust of U.S. goals and his belief that the United States seeks to contain China. Xi's speech was the most public and direct criticism that we have seen from him to date, and probably reflects growing pessimism in Beijing about China's relationship with the United States, as well as his growing worries about the trajectory of China's domestic economic development and indigenous technology innovation, which he now seeks to blame on the United States. And even as the rhetoric has become more heated, we continue to assess that Beijing wants to preserve stability and avoid triggering additional technology restrictions or sanctions from the United States and our partners as they seek to narrow the gap in their economic and technological competition with us. Perceiving the United States as a threat, the PRC seeks to undercut U.S. influence and is looking to portray the United States as the root of global problems. China seeks to divide us from our allies and partners, frame U.S. actions as provocations that provide a basis for planned PRC aggression, which they then claim are simply responses, such as China's expansion of its military presence surrounding Taiwan, which the PRC asserted was in response to President Tsai's recent transit through the United States, as well as her meetings with two speakers of the House over the past year. And China's leaders are focused on spurring domestic economic growth this year, but in the long run, spurring indigenous technology innovation is paramount. President Xi remains confident that Beijing can innovate its way to the technological frontier, regardless of U.S. and allied restrictions, and that doing so will give China the competitive advantage that is crucial to achieving his vision for China as a world power. Nonetheless, we are likely to see more dissonant messaging and actions coming out of Beijing, such as the recent charm offensive by Premier Li Qiang, welcoming foreign direct investment at the China Development Forum, juxtaposed against Beijing's pressure on foreign firms and executives, including investigations of U.S. firms and a clampdown on previous non-sensitive data flows out of China. And the IC assesses that China's long-term economic growth will continue to decelerate because China's era of rapid catch-up growth is ending, and structural issues such as debt, demographics, inequality, over-reliance on investment and inadequate domestic consumption remain. And although the CCP may find ways to overcome its structural challenges over the long term, in the short term it continues to take an increasingly aggressive approach to external affairs, often to bolster its domestic agenda. China's leaders are increasing their investment in a world-class military, expanding their country's nuclear arsenal and cyber threat capacity, pursuing counter-space weapons capable of targeting U.S. and allied satellites, forcing foreign companies and coercing foreign countries to allow the transfer of technology and intellectual property in order to boost indigenous capabilities, continuing to increase global supply chain dependencies on China with the possibility of using such dependencies to threaten and cut off foreign countries during a crisis. And the CCP is also seeking to reshape global governance in line with Xi's preferences and governance standards that support the monopoly of power within China and expanding influence operations, including through the export of digital repression technologies. And furthermore, we've observed the expanding strategic ties between China and Russia, as mentioned by the chairman, another critical priority for the IC, which has been strengthened by the conflict in Ukraine. We're now over a year into the war, which is reshaping not only Russia's global relationships and strategic standing, but also our own, strengthening our alliances and partnerships in ways that President Putin almost certainly did not anticipate, often precipitating the very events he hoped to avoid, such as Finland's accession to NATO and Sweden's petition to join, while also increasing Xi's leverage over Putin. On the battlefield, the fighting is principally focused in the east around Bakhmut and Avdiivka, and remains a brutally grinding war of attrition in which neither military has a definitive advantage, with day-to-day fighting over hundreds of meters. Russian forces gained less territory in April than during any of the 3 previous months, as they appear to transition from offensive to defensive operations along the front lines. Russian forces are facing significant shortfalls in munitions and are under significant personnel constraints, but continue to lay minefields and prepare new defensive positions in occupied Ukrainian territory. Both sides are focusing on preparations for a potential Ukrainian counteroffensive this spring or summer, designed to push Russia out of illegally annexed territory. And the Ukrainian armed forces are still finalizing the specific priorities, timing, and scale of the offensive, and Western assistance will be crucial in preparing both plans and forces. With the support of the Congress, the United States is doing a great deal to bolster Ukraine's chances for success. But even if Ukraine's counteroffensive is not fully successful, the Russians are unlikely to be able to mount a significant offensive operation this year. In fact, if Russia does not initiate a mandatory mobilization and secure substantial third-party ammunition supplies beyond existing deliveries from Iran and others, it will be increasingly challenging for them to sustain even modest offensive operations. At the same time, of course, Ukraine remains heavily dependent on external military aid, and would likely be unable to counter Russia's natural relative manpower and resource advantages if most Western military aid ceased. Furthermore, while we continue to assess that Putin most likely calculates that time works in his favor and that prolonging the war may be his best remaining pathway to eventually securing Russia's strategic interests in Ukraine, we assess that Putin probably has scaled back his immediate ambitions to consolidate control of the occupied territory in eastern and southern Ukraine and ensuring that Ukraine will never become a NATO ally. Putin's willingness to consider a negotiated pause may be based on his assessment that a pause would provide a respite for Russian forces as they could try to use that time to regain strength before resuming offensive operations at some point in the future, while buying time for what he hopes will be an erosion of Western support for Ukraine. Yet he may be willing to claim at least a temporary victory based on roughly the territory he is occupying. And the challenge is that even as Putin may be scaling back his near-term ambitions, the prospect for Russian concessions to advance negotiations this year will be low unless domestic political vulnerabilities alter his thinking. And of course, as the conflict continues, the human toll is only getting worse. In addition to the many tens of thousands of casualties suffered by Ukrainian and Russian militaries, more than 8 million people have been forced to flee Ukraine since Russia invaded. Moreover, in addition to Moscow's continued assault on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, particularly its energy facilities and electrical grid, there is widespread reporting of atrocities committed by Russian forces. Russia and its proxy groups are using so-called filtration operations to detain and forcibly deport tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians to Russia. The IC is engaged with other parts of the U.S. government to document and hold Russia and Russian actors accountable for their actions. Moscow has suffered military losses that will require years of rebuilding and leave it less capable of posing a conventional military threat to Europe and operating assertively in Eurasia and on the global stage. But as a result, Russia will become even more reliant on asymmetric options, such as nuclear, cyber, space capabilities, and on China. And our annual assessment also covers Iran, North Korea, the many regional challenges we face, including in Africa, where, of course, we've seen a recent outbreak of fighting in Sudan, which is no stranger to conflict. The fighting in Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces is, we assess, likely to be protracted, as both sides believe that they can win militarily and have few incentives to come to the negotiating table. Both sides are seeking external sources of support, which, if successful, is likely to intensify the conflict and create a greater potential for spillover challenges in the region. But even so, the fighting is exacerbating already dire humanitarian conditions in Sudan, forcing relief organizations to curtail operations, raising the specter of massive refugee flows and aid needs in the region. Even before the fighting started, roughly 1/3 of the population, or approximately 15.8 million people, required immediate assistance because of disease outbreaks, inflation, localized conflicts, internal displacement, and weather-related food insecurity. And throughout the world, as I noted at the outset, the state actor challenges we inventory are undermining our capacity to work together with other countries to address what are utterly critical transnational threats, such as climate change, public health challenges, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic, the threat from illicit drugs, terrorism, irregular migration. Before concluding, I just want to raise with you a legislative authority of fundamental importance to the intelligence community and the work we do, which will expire at the end of this year if Congress does not act. I'm referring to Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and I can tell you without hesitation that Section 702 was relied upon in gathering some of the intelligence that formed the basis of this assessment, as it is hard to overestimate the importance of this authority to our work more generally. FISA Section 702 allows the intelligence community to collect on the communication of specifically targeted foreign persons who are located outside the United States, and in doing so provides unique intelligence on foreign intelligence targets at a speed and reliability that we just simply cannot replicate in any other authority. Section 702 was originally enacted to enable the U.S. government to quickly collect on the communications of terrorists located abroad by allowing the IC to acquire foreign intelligence from non-U.S. people located outside of the United States who are using U.S. electronic communication service providers. And 702 is still vital to our counterterrorism mission, but now it is also principally relied upon for key insights across a range of our highest priority threats. In fact, 702 acquired information has been used to protect against a series of conventional and cyber attacks posed by China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. For example, I can tell you that 702 acquired information enabled the United States to gain insights into the PRC's efforts to monitor, track, and persecute Chinese nationals believed to be dissidents. 702 acquired information has also been used to identify multiple ransomware attacks against U.S. critical infrastructure, allowing the U.S. government to respond to, mitigate, and in some cases prevent attacks. 702 acquired information has been used to prevent components for weapons of mass destruction from reaching foreign actors. And 702 acquired information has resulted in the identification and disruption of hostile foreign actors' attempts to recruit spies in or send their operatives to the United States. And I realize that 702 is a powerful authority, and it's incumbent on all of us in the intelligence community to ensure the privacy and civil liberties of Americans are built into its design and implementation at every level. And over the last many years, we have significantly expanded oversight and dedicated resources to compliance in order to do just that, and we welcome the opportunity to help you understand better the oversight framework we've built as we work to authorize this critical authority. So thank you so much for your patience, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director Haynes. General Berrier, please.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to discuss DIA's assessment of the global security environment. Before I begin, I too would like to take a moment to recognize and honor Lieutenant General Vince Stewart, DIA's 20th Director. Vince passed away in his sleep last Friday. We lost a giant, an intellectual giant, a trailblazer, and a really good friend. Vince was a gifted and talented Marine intelligence officer who positively touched the lives of many in every organization he served in or led. We mourn his loss, we grieve with his family, and we honor his memory. I'm pleased to join Director Haynes today to discuss the complex threat landscape and our work to provide timely, insightful, and rigorous intelligence. DIA and the Defense Intelligence Enterprise are transforming our approach to meet threats to our nation posed by strategic competition with China, Russia, and other foreign nations. With your continued support, DIA and the DIE will continue to excel in providing all-source analysis, human and technical collection, open-source collection, material exploitation, modeling and simulations, and other unique mission sets. This will most likely be the last time I testify before this committee as I approach my 39th year of service in our Army and pending retirement. I've become somewhat reflective on how the threat landscape has changed. In 1984, it was a bipolar world, the U.S. and our partners in a Cold War with the USSR. In my first assignment, I served as an infantry battalion intelligence officer, or an S2, in Alaska. One of our missions was to protect critical oil infrastructure in the high north from a Spetsnaz attack. My 23-year-old self didn't think much of that mission at the time. It wasn't very exciting. But in retrospect, it was an important mission then, and protecting critical infrastructure is a really important mission today. The difference is the threat landscape is exponentially more dangerous today than it was in 1984. We are now in a multipolar world with strategic competition at the forefront. The events of the past year clearly demonstrate that our competitors are emboldened and that they are attempting to forcefully recast the rules-based international order and challenge U.S. interests. From Russia's unprovoked and unjustified full-scale invasion of Ukraine, to China's military assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region, to an unprecedented number of North Korean missile launches, to Iranian-directed action against U.S. forces in the Middle East. The United States now faces a multifaceted security environment in which authoritarian regimes are testing our resolve through their provocative military actions, developing capabilities to hold the homeland at risk, and showing greater risk tolerance for potential escalation. Like you, I am very concerned about ongoing threats from China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and violent extremist organizations. But China is our pacing challenge and DIA's top priority. Beijing is expanding its global influence and stepping up its multi-domain pressure campaign against Taiwan, as observed by its sharply increased rhetoric and military activity over the last year. Xi Jinping's attainment of a third term as the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party positions Beijing for further progress on military modernization and operational goals that will challenge the U.S. during the next year and beyond. The war in Ukraine is also a priority for DIA, and for the Russian military, 2022 is not a good year. The new-look army is gone, and in my view, we are at a particularly dangerous place with Russia. Putin is not seeking an off-ramp, and Moscow has asserted publicly that it remains committed to achieving its objectives in Ukraine through military force. China and Russia are seeking to incorporate advanced technologies to erode our U.S. technological advantage. China is pursuing a whole-of-nation approach to technology development, and the PLA believes that integrating future technologies, especially AI and quantum, will constitute a major revolution in military affairs. As Director, I have pressed agency leaders to up our game, relook business operations, and transform our missions to meet customer needs and to address unprecedented national security challenges. Transformation and change are imperatives, and I am pleased that DIA is making real-world progress on our mission sets. DIA has exceptional expertise, responsibilities, and missions that you trust us to lead. and as such, foundational military intelligence, defense, human, and counterintelligence, measurement and signature intelligence, or MASINT, and JWICS. Our strategic, operational, and tactical defense intelligence supports warfighters, defense planners, policymakers, and the acquisition community, and I look forward to discussing real-world examples of our progress. One final area I would like to highlight is the workforce at DIA. As you know, our workforce spans the globe with innovative and forward-leaning officers, and these talented and dedicated experts are making strides to defend the United States and our allies. From our defense attachés to analysts to technical collectors to our enabling force, these professionals are mission-focused and working tirelessly behind the scenes for our nation. DIA is investing in the workforce and the infrastructure that supports their behind-the-scenes work, bringing together talented officers with varied experiences and giving them the tools and authorities to conduct intelligence is at DIA's core, and investing in our people is a critical step to modernizing the next generation of intelligence capabilities. I'm proud to represent a workforce that provides intelligence on foreign actors to prevent and win wars and to illuminate opportunities to enable the United States to outpace our strategic competitors. I welcome your questions on the global threat environment, and thank you for your continued support and opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, General. Thank you both for your detailed and thoughtful testimony. Director Haynes, Secretary Yellen indicated that we will exceed the debt limit by June 1st, requiring action before that. Have the intelligence community assessed the international consequences of default on our debt?
Thank you, Chairman. We don't have certainty on the outcome of the financial markets nor of countries' opinions of sort of economic and political leadership that might be affected by a default on the debt. But I would say that what our assessment is that regardless of its duration, of a default's duration, almost certainly it would create global uncertainty about the value of the U.S. dollar and U.S. institutions and leadership, leading to volatility in currency and financial markets and commodity markets that are priced in dollars. And that's basically as far as our analysts are able to provide.
Let me follow up is, and you might want to take this for the closed session also, but our adversaries, I would presume, would want to exploit any type of difficulty that we have. Do we have any indications that China in particular is preparing for exploitation of this, either through disinformation in the United States or through financial or other moves?
So I don't have any information that suggests that they're planning for that, but I think our analysts would agree with you that it would be, almost a certainty that they would look to take advantage of the opportunity, and they generally, both Russia and China, would look to perceive, sort of narrate through information operations such an event as demonstrating the chaos within the United States that we're not capable of functioning as a democracy, and sort of the governance issues associated with it. They've done that on a range of things.
Thank you. General Berrier, we had General Cavoli here, who's doing a superb job, and he indicated that Russia remains a formidable force despite their significant losses in personnel in Ukraine, because the air, maritime, space, cyber, and strategic forces have not really been committed to that effort. What's DIA's assessment of Russia's capacity?
Very, very similar. Still an existential threat with the nuclear arsenal that they have. General Cavoli is correct that their strategic forces have largely been untested here, and it's still formidable.
So that the significant redistribution of forces out of Europe would still be a challenge because of their existing capacities?
I think from a deterrence standpoint, Russia fears strength, and so even though their ground forces are degraded right now, they will quickly build those back.
Thank you. And Director Haynes, as I said in my statement, the intelligence community has done some remarkable work with respect to Russia and Ukraine by exposing activities the Russians were contemplating before they could do it, not only embarrassing them, but in many cases frustrating their ability to do it. Are we ready to use that same approach to other adversaries, such as China, in terms of strategically using intelligence to disrupt their operations?
Thank you, sir. I think we can talk about this also in closed session a bit more, but as a general matter, we have learned some techniques and mechanisms that will not be forgotten coming out of the conflict with Ukraine that I think we can deploy in other scenarios, which have allowed us to do more sharing and downgrading of information, kind of working as a team across the IC to try to preserve sources and methods in that process. And I think we will look to do that, but I think it will be more challenging in different areas depending on what those sources and methods are and how we can manage that concern as we move forward.
Just quickly for both of you, we've had this incident with the Air National Guardsman Texera years before that, Snowden, so this is not really new. We thought and we think every time this happens, we put in place things like keystroke logging, more restricted controls, but we're still having problems. So just quickly, Director Haynes, what can we do to make sure we have more appropriate controls?
Yeah, thank you, sir. It's been absolutely extremely frustrating, obviously, and demoralizing for folks in the intelligence community who work so hard, frankly, to put together the kind of intelligence that then gets disclosed in leaks, and the damage that it does to our national security is just unacceptable on every level, obviously, and I appreciate the support. I think what I can tell you at this stage is only an interim answer because we are still getting the information from the investigation as to what exactly happened, and to understand that is obviously then to have greater confidence in saying that the things that we're doing are going to make a difference to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And right now, what we are doing is looking to ensure that we, in fact, have the best, user activity monitoring, other techniques that we use, that we are, again, scrubbing and reviewing our processes for ensuring that there is only information provided on a need-to-know basis, that when there is user privileges, that they are appropriately granted, that we have additional, controls around these issues, and we can obviously talk about this more in closed session.
Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haynes, I don't want to get into a long discussion about the debt limit, but it is a fact, is it not, that the House of Representatives has passed a bill that would raise the debt limit. If it were passed by the Senate and signed into law by the President, a default would be avoided. That is correct, is it not?
Sir, I will confess that I am not tracking the puts and takes of this, but I absolutely, I'm sure you're right.
Well, I think I am right, and I just wanted to point that out. The House has done its work, and the Senate now needs to pass a bill and get it to the President's desk. But let me ask you this, Director Haynes. The General said since he was a young officer, the threat has changed, the threat has exponentially increased. Do you agree that this is the most complex and dangerous threat environment since World War II? And I'll ask that to both of you. Director Haynes first.
Sure. Thank you, sir. I feel as if you always feel as if the time that you're in is the most complex and most challenging. I do feel that way, but I am a little bit conscious of the sort of cognitive bias that's associated with that. But I think it is, as our annual threat assessment.
Well, this is a very complex and dangerous threat environment, is it not? General, is this the most complex and dangerous threat environment since World War II?
Senator, I believe it is. When you consider the advances in technology, the precision of weapons, the globalization, information, the rise of China, along with what Russia has been up to, and then you consider dangerous regional actors like Iran, North Korea, and the continued threat of violent extremist organizations, it seems like the most complex.
And do you then agree, General, that the authorization bill and the appropriation bills that Congress passes this year should represent acting accordingly to address this greatest threat?
Senator, there is a threat there. I support the President's budget, and I'll just leave it there.
Okay, I think that answer speaks speaks loudly. China gives us a figure, General Berrier, about how much they spend. They say $224 billion annually on their military. Do you agree that China spends significantly more than they publicly admit? And what's your best estimate of how much their annual defense spending is?
Senator, there are a number of factors that go into that estimate. I'd be more comfortable in a closed session to discuss that.
And Director Haynes, I guess you don't want to discuss that publicly also. Well, let's then let both of you discuss what this Ukraine war has done to Russia's military capability, not only today, but over the next 10 to 15 years. General?
Number of factors as well, Senator. I think, just the combat losses, and I spoke of this in my opening statement about the New Look Army. The reorganization that the Russian military took in the early 2000s meant that they would be better, faster, smaller, if you will, from what they were in the Soviet era. That army largely is gone, and they're relying on reserves and reserve equipment, older Soviet-era kinds of kit. It's going to take them a while to build back to more advanced kit. The estimates go from 5 to 10 years based on how sanctions affect them and their ability to put technology back into their force. So I think they've had a setback in the ground forces, but still very, very capable in their strategic forces.
Director Haynes, the next 10 to 15 years, based on what has happened to the Russian conventional military capability so far.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with General Berrier. There's no question, and I think unanimity in the intelligence community, it will take years for the Russians to build back up their ground forces. They've really significantly degraded them, but they nevertheless have, as indicated, strategic force, other forces, and that doesn't mean that they're not a powerful military force.
Okay, well, and let me just say this with regard to my previous question. There is an unclassified Department of Defense annual China military power report. That's not secret. It doesn't need to be said down in the skiff. It states that China's, quote, actual military-related spending is likely significantly higher than what it states in its official budget, unquote. You don't disagree with that, Director Haynes, do you?
No, I think one aspect of it is the civil-military fusion that we see in China, where so much of, in fact, their civilian industry is actually adapted and used by their military, and when you consider that, it's a significant.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Shaheen, please.
Thank you both for being here and for your service to the country. Director Haynes, I want to go back to your comments about the 702 reauthorization, because I returned from, along with a number of my colleagues, including Senator Budd, we returned from South America a couple of weeks ago, where we visited 4 countries, and the 702 reauth came up, or at least the ability of the intel community to use those authorizations to address the challenges facing the country. And I was particularly interested in the counter-narcotics effort, because we continue to have a huge issue in New Hampshire with the opioid epidemic. So I do think it's very important for us to continue to have those authorities, but there are also some very real concerns about privacy that we've heard. So can you talk to how important it is for these authorities to help us continue with counter-narcotics efforts, and also what we're doing in terms of addressing the privacy concerns?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator. And I think, this is one of the challenges for us has been in the intelligence community, frankly, trying to declassify examples of how it is that we've used 702 so that the public has a better understanding of the value of this authority and the collection that we have. But I'll say, as a general matter, it has been an important authority for use in the context of countering narcotics trafficking, and in many respects used to help support our foreign partners in interdictions as a general matter, and that is something that has been critical. In terms of the privacy and civil liberties pieces of this, I mean, what I would say is, we have a number of things that we do in order to try to monitor and assess our compliance, and then to ultimately design the system in such a way as to incentivize and promote compliance, making it, in other words, technically hard to do things that are non-compliant, and then ultimately have increased extraordinary investments into training of folks who would use the system, and then to making adjustments as we go through the process where we see something goes wrong, and then actually addressing it, and also holding people accountable in the context of any compliance violations. And just to give you a couple of things, on an annual basis, the entire program is reviewed and recertified by the Foreign Intelligence Court, essentially, as one piece. Also, we do semi-annual compliance reports to Congress. We have a joint 60-day review, my office and the Department of Justice, of targeting decisions of any U.S. person queries that are done through the databases that exist and dissemination. We have targeting and minimization procedures for each element that are not just reviewed by the Attorney General but go to the FISC court. Again, we go through a variety of ways in which to try to ensure that we've created, in effect, a virtuous cycle where we can ensure that everything that we're doing is, in fact, promoting compliance, and then monitoring it to see if that's in fact what's happening, and then addressing challenges as they come and move forward. And then we also have been providing reports publicly about non-compliance incidents so that we can show the American people, we can have all of you and your constituents look at what's happening and see where we make progress, where we make mistakes, how we address it, and then how we move forward on it so that we can actually build the trust that's necessary. Thank you.
Good, thank you. You both mentioned cyber in your, I think you both mentioned cyber in your remarks, but I didn't hear either of you talk about the efforts to address disinformation. And one of the places where our adversaries have certainly been very effective, I think more effective than we have been in responding in many cases, has been in the disinformation arena. Can you speak to what we're doing and how we're coordinating with other operations like the Global Engagement Center at the State Department?
Sure, I'll start, and Chairman Berrier, if you want to add to this. But Congress put into law that we should establish a foreign malign influence center in the intelligence community. We have stood that up, and it encompasses our election threat executive work, essentially looking at foreign influence and interference in elections, but it also deals with disinformation more generally. And what we have been doing is effectively trying to support the Global Engagement Center, others throughout the U.S. government, in helping them to understand what are the plans and intentions of the key actors in this space: China, Russia, other, Iran, et cetera. And then give them a sense of what it is that we're seeing in terms of the techniques that they use, how they go about this, and provide that for policymakers so that they're able to take that information and hopefully counter it and address it.
Thank you.
I think DIA's perspective on this, Senator, is really speed. We want to be able to detect that, and it's really with our open source collection capability, working with our combatant command partners where this is happening all over the world, and then the ability to turn something quickly with them under the right authorities to counter that disinformation or misinformation.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today. Director Haynes, last year you testified that, quote, China will continue to essentially expand their nuclear arsenal and diversification for a period of time, end quote. Has that assessment changed, or does the intelligence community still maintain it?
That assessment has not changed.
And in public reports, we've seen that the DIA has assessed that China will deploy 1,500 warheads by 2035. The STRATCOM commander, General Cotton, has also publicly confirmed that U.S. China has now surpassed the United States in the number of fixed and mobile land-based launches for ICBM. General Berrier, do you agree with that assessment still?
I do agree.
Thank you. Director Haynes, does the Intelligence Committee assess that China has any interest in pursuing arms control agreements that would restrict their development of nuclear weapons?
No, as a general matter, we have not seen China express interest in arms control agreements in this area.
And General Berrier, we've seen reports that Russia is providing China with plutonium for Chinese fast breeder reactors. In fact, it was reported by a UK think tank. They noted that between September and December of 2022, Russia provided 7 times more highly enriched uranium to China than the United States and the International Atomic Energy Agency have secured over the past 30 years. What are the implications of that increased level of cooperation of their nuclear programs?
The layers of cooperation between China and Russia go very, very deep. I cannot speak to the specifics of the uranium aspect of that, if true. It's an acceleration of programs in development and technology transfer.
And Director Haynes, do you have anything to add to that?
No.
Is there any movement within the administration to look at, first of all, to set up agreements again with Russia? And is there any, I would say, false hope by this administration to believe that they could pull in Russia, let alone trying to pull in China in those talks?
I couldn't speak to that just because it's obviously in the policy community, and I'm not sure I would know, frankly, what it is that they're looking at.
Okay, thank you. Also, Director Haynes, looking at Afghanistan, do you assess that ISIS-K still seeks to conduct external operations against the United States, our forces, and our allies and partners?
Yes.
Do you agree with the assessment that we had in March from General Kurilla about how long it would take ISIS-K to generate the capability to conduct external operations? He told us at that time that any operation between or against the United States and Western interests abroad could happen within 6 months with little or no warning. Would you agree with that?
I'd have to take that back, to be honest. There's been a number of developments even since General Kurilla apparently testified on this issue of taking out key external ops folks within ISIS-K, and I think that might affect the timeline. But I'm happy to take that for the record.
Do you feel that we've lost information gathering capabilities and also CT operations in Afghanistan since our withdrawal?
We certainly, the intelligence community has been clear about the fact that we are not able to collect as much information today as we were, obviously, when the troops were in Afghanistan.
How would you, I guess, rate the amount of intelligence that we are able to gather in Afghanistan? Because it's my understanding our CT operations are basically nil. We are looking at hardly anybody on the ground to be able to help. So how do you rate what we are able to get when we're looking at a threat against not just United States interests and persons, but also our Western allies, the growing threats that we're facing there?
To be specific, we'd have to do this, I think, in closed session. But as a general matter, what we've sought to do is to try to trying to think how to do this in an unclassified way, but develop enough collection opportunities so that we can monitor the threat. It is definitely, as you indicated, degraded from what we had previously, and we can discuss the details in closed session.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Gillibrand, please.
Director Haynes, the DoD and the IC are engaged in cyber operations against our adversaries every day and gain intelligence about how these adversaries operate and intend to operate in the cyber domain. However, in the event of a large-scale cyber attack on the homeland, CISA is in the leading role. How much of your intelligence on, for example, the PRC cyber threat are you able to share with CISA, and how much must remain inside the DoD and the IC?
We share almost everything with CISA, honestly. They get our analysis on these issues. They see the raw intelligence. We have overlap in terms of even intelligence that we get from commercial threat indexes and so on. So it's quite open sharing in that respect.
And when we rely on allies across the globe for operations and assistance, are we able to leverage our efforts with what we do with CISA with those allies?
Yeah, it's a great question. In fact, I mean, we have talked to allies about, for example, recognizing that so much of the critical cyber threat information exists in the commercial sector because we're trying to see how it is that adversaries are attacking them. We have talked to allies about working together in order to obtain and leverage each other's commercial threat information where that's permitted based on the agreements that we have with the commercial sector, and working with CISA to ensure that they have access to that information. That's an example of working with allies and partners in a way that can help CISA to better have, the landscape and the picture that they need for the work that they do.
And in the event of a substantial cyber attack by China on our domestic infrastructure, what would the chain of command look like in terms of defense and response?
I think it would depend on, this probably is not the best question for me, but I think it would depend on where the response is being conducted and how they're approaching it. Obviously, the president is the final authority in any event, but how it would work through the system, I suspect, might have some differences.
Lieutenant General Berrier, on the same question.
Nothing to add to that, ma'am.
Our government often talks about how our allies and partners are strategic advantage. From the perspective of China, Russia, and Iran, who are the allies and partners they are most concerned about building closer relationships with, and how would building closer relationships with those countries impact regional deterrence? And as context, I recently took a trip to the Middle East to study the impact of the Abraham Accords on UAE, on Morocco, Bahrain, and Israel. And with regard to that, obviously there was concern when Saudi Arabia decided to engage China in their negotiations with Iran. What is the impact of being able to bring Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords in the context of the larger question?
And Senator Gillibrand, forgive me, I missed the very first part of your question. Can you just repeat the first sentence?
Just that we often talk about how our allies and partners are our strategic advantage. And so from the perspective of China, Russia, Iran, who are they most concerned about? And then as an example, the Abraham Accords, I think, is a very strategic partnership for us that should be seen as very powerful. And how did the recent efforts by China to negotiate with Saudi Arabia and Iran affect that strategic alliance, and whether that was a powerful strategic alliance we should have been pushing for?
Yeah, so I think what our analysts would point to as a general matter would be a whole series of key countries that are sometimes referred to as hedging states that are in the space between, you indicated UAE as an example of this in a sense. There may be others. It's probably easier to talk about this in a closed session. But there are a variety of countries where, in effect, they're looking at the United States and China and Russia on the other side, in effect, and trying to diversify their relationship in a way that allows them to maximize their interests while at the same time pursue, sort of economic and other security strategies in each of these spaces. I would say with Saudi Arabia in particular, that and the Abraham Accords more generally, that we do think there's been kind of a value of bringing these countries together under certain circumstances, and that interaction has provided some security benefits to the United States and to others. But I think it's, each case would have to be looked at on a case-by-case basis in order to sort of identify what are some of the pros and cons. I'm not sure that was very helpful. Apologies.
Senator, I would say that your question is a bullseye on the discussion of strategic competition and what strategic competition is. We know that China and Russia are seeking partnerships with countries that have historically been U.S. partners, and this is the nature of the changing landscape and the complexity of the environment that I described in my opening statement. And we have to be there, and we have to be a better solution, whether that's through intelligence sharing or other partnerships. I don't think it's a lost cause. I think there's a lot we can do, and I think people see the goodness in what the United States brings, and we have to go forward with that.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Cotton, please.
Thank you both for your appearance. I want to extend my condolences as well to the family of General Stewart, who was a trailblazing Marine. I'm surprised it's gotten to me, the seventh questioner, and no one's raised the fact that Russia's government has accused Ukraine of trying to assassinate President Putin and saying that the United States goaded them into it. Seems like kind of a big deal. Big if true, as the kids say today. Dr. Haynes, what do you have to say about these claims from Russia's government?
Well, obviously, you've seen the Ukrainian government deny their, having engaged in this. And at this stage, we don't have information that would allow us to provide an independent assessment on this.
Okay. General Berrier?
I think it gets after Senator Sheen's comment about misinformation.
Perhaps some grounds to think that maybe these claims are exaggerated. One, do we know that Vladimir Putin doesn't spend the night at the Kremlin all that much? Is that correct, Director Haynes?
Yes.
Kremlin is not like the White House, in other words. It's not the primary residence of the president of Russia. Even if you were there, these drones from the videos I've seen, they do not appear to be the size of weapons that could do significant damage to the Kremlin. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. They also appear to be the kinds of drones that would require relatively close line of sight control, which means someone on the ground in Moscow, which is not known as an open and friendly city to people who are hostile to the Russian government. Is that correct, General Berrier?
Potentially from the photos that I've seen, yes.
Yeah. In most attacks on Russian soil, Ukraine's government has been ambiguous or silent about responsibility for the attacks. Yet in this case, they've explicitly disclaimed any responsibility. Is that correct, Director Haynes?
Yes.
All right. General Berrier, I think you might have been onto something when you said that this sounds like misinformation. I want to move on to another matter, Director Haynes, about Mexican drug cartels. They're causing now more deaths in America than we lost every year in the Vietnam War, or every year in America than the entire Vietnam War. In fact, almost twice what we lost in the Vietnam War due to fentanyl alone. Has the intelligence community produced a national intelligence estimate on the threat that the cartels pose to America?
No, we have not, sir.
So an NIE is the most authoritative written judgment on national security matters. Is that correct?
It is an authoritative. I suspect it would become in list. Yes.
Do you have any plans to produce an NIE on the threat the cartels pose to America?
We do actually have something on our calendar that is on transnational criminal organizations, including the cartels in this space.
Thank you. I think that's warranted, and I'll look forward to seeing it. Director Haynes, you mentioned earlier that it will take Russia years to rebuild its ground forces, and I believe you were saying that to express agreement with General Berrier. Is that correct? And General Berrier, you believe it will take years for Russia to rebuild its ground combat forces. Most intelligence agencies inaccurately judged the early days of the war. They thought that Russia would roll into Kyiv very quickly and conquer most, if not all, of Ukraine. General Berrier, was that a result of our intelligence agencies underestimating the Ukrainians or overestimating the Russians?
Senator, I think it was a combination of both.
Okay. When you're making your own operational plans, you have to make assessments about the adversary, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and that's true whether you're operating at the platoon level or at the national strategic level.
Yes.
So it's fair to say, based on the fact that we now know we overestimated Russia's capabilities as of last February, and we've seen their forces degraded to the point it'll take years to rebuild them, that they are a much weaker fighting force than we thought 14 months ago, right?
That is what we currently assess, yes.
Shouldn't our operational plans about a potential war with Russia in Europe then be changed to reflect that new understanding?
I think in the purview of U.S. European Command and the Department of Defense, they're looking at all that, Senator.
Yeah. They need to urgently, because one of the reasons we've heard on this committee about the slow pace at which we're delivering certain weapons is that our operational plans require it. And if our operational plan in Europe is based on what we thought Russia was capable of 14 months ago versus what they are capable now, it badly needs to be revisited. Director Haynes, one final line of questions about Russia. They've gotten a lot more aggressive towards the United States recently. We all remember the Black Sea incident when one of their aircraft downed an MQ-9 drone. The head of U.S. Air Force's Central Command recently said that Russia is, quote, increasingly bellicose towards American aircraft in Syria, suggesting they even are looking for a fight. They're spoiling for a dogfight. And then third, the head of European Command, General Cavoli, recently noted that Russian submarines have gotten more active in the Atlantic than they have been in years. One, are there other instances of growing Russian aggression? And two, what's the intelligence community's assessment for why Russia has grown increasingly aggressive in these ways?
Can we address this in closed session?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Kane, please.
Thank you to our witnesses. Director Haynes, in your opening testimony, you said that the Chinese are growing more and more pessimistic about the U.S.-China relationship. What is the source of that growing pessimism?
I would say that there's a number of factors that are leaning in that direction, in the sense that, and we can maybe do a little more in closed session to get to what the root of this is, but I think they are increasingly perceiving the sort of zero-sum game that I mentioned effectively in the opening testimony, where, in essence, we have always understood that they perceive themselves, or for the last few years now, as being on the rise, and they perceive the United States as being on the decline, and they ultimately are concerned about the potential for conflict as we pass each other, is sort of the classic frame through which they piece this.
Is some of the pessimism related to their perceptions of statements by American political figures?
Sure. I mean, but it's all of a larger piece, which is to say that I think that they continue to perceive that they can't do what they want to do without essentially pushing back on the United States and ultimately countering us in ways that, and our allies, frankly, in a variety of different ways.
A great president once said, speak softly and carry a big stick. I'll let my colleagues, we all have our own judgment about the size of the stick we're carrying, or should. I have noticed on the speak softly side of the Roosevelt maximum, we've been getting louder and louder with respect to China concerns. We had the hearing with the Indo-Pacific leadership recently, and the opening statement is a boilerplate at that hearing. War with China is neither inevitable or necessary, but then the remaining hours of the hearing was just one statement after the next that someone trying to perceive what the intentions were here might well lead to the conclusion that, wow, we are more pessimistic because of statements that are being made. How did, from an intelligence standpoint, I was concerned at the news that during the Chinese balloon incident, Secretary Austin tried to call his counterpart, and the Chinese counterpart would not answer the phone. That was publicly reported? Is that accurate?
I believe it is. I will tell you that as a general matter, the Chinese typically clamp down in a crisis, and they don't, engage, and that is a classic paradigm.
And that's a little bit different than Russia, correct? That even in tough times, at least the lines of communication between the military to hopefully de-escalate generally remain open with Russia. Isn't that also the case?
Yes.
We want to try to be very strong to deter war. We want to be prepared to win any war we should need to. But we would also want to avoid wars based on bad intel. We have a recent history of getting into a war against Iraq based on bad intel regarding Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction program. But we would also want to do everything we could to avoid wars based on miscommunication, misunderstanding, unnecessary escalations. Is that correct?
Yes.
What is your, as the DNI, what is your current level of concern about the prospect of getting into unnecessary military action based upon a miscommunication or unnecessary escalation? Is that a small concern, or is it a concern that worries you?
Absolutely worries me. I mean, I think, that's part of the job, right, is that we need to be as vigilant as we possibly can in order to be able to help our policymakers, our decision makers, all of you have a better understanding of what's actually happening so that there isn't that kind of unintended escalation or miscalculation. And I think one of the challenges that we all recognize in the context of our relationship with China is that because there is that kind of clamp down during crises that we were just talking about, it puts an extraordinary premium on our capacity to be able to provide insight on what's happening in those moments.
I think that's a wise concern to have. Last thing I'll just say is the unclassified annual threat assessment that you shared with the committee was 40 pages long. 2 pages were pertaining to the Western Hemisphere. I also recently returned from a trip into the Americas, and the issues there, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's immigration challenges, whether it's political instability, but also the fact that our adversaries are investing so heavily in the Western Hemisphere, suggests to me that we ought to be paying more attention. Both the Southcom budget and some other budgetary items suggest that we're really under-resourcing the region, and that's something that I'll try to work with my colleagues on. But thanks to the witnesses for your testimony and your service.
Thank you, Senator Kane. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me begin by thanking both of you for your service to our country. General Berrier, really appreciate 39 years, and especially to your family. This is a lot of deployments, a lot of time away from home, and it is truly deployments that are handled not just by you, but by your family as well, and we thank you for that. Let me begin with Director Haynes. I think Senator Shaheen began a series of questions regarding 702 and asking for an explanation really about how it works and so forth. I'm just curious, with regard to our adversaries, do you think that they believe that there is an opportunity to manipulate or provide misinformation about some of the programs that we have in this country? And has there been evidence that they have tried to manipulate public information or provide misinformation concerning some of our more capable programs?
I'm trying to think of a specific instance. There is.
I'd prefer not to do a
please.
specific, just not so that, because we're in an unclassified discussion, but just in general, do you think that they believe that they can influence political decisions here by providing misinformation publicly?
Yes, absolutely. They have typically engaged in such activities in order to try to influence public debate on issues that are of importance to them. And so
702 might be one of those as an example.
Could be. I don't have particular information that indicates that that's happening, but.
General Berrier, would there be assessments made that our adversaries attempt to manipulate or to influence political decisions with misinformation or propaganda being provided?
I think it's clear that they have participated in that activity and they would take advantage of any opportunity that might present itself. Yes.
Do you think 702 might be one of those programs that they would try to?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially. How about with regard to some of our military capabilities and some of the challenges that we sometimes have? It wouldn't be beneath them to try to manipulate decisions on a public level that would influence our ability to defend our country if we had the opportunity. Fair enough?
I agree with that.
Lately I've been really kind of following up on the issue of the sharing of spectrum with regard to areas, particularly in the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz area. This is the S-band. And I'm just kind of curious. We have a number of different very, very important missions that rely on that portion of the S-band. Would that be a fair statement, General Berrier?
It would be, yes.
Are you aware of any of the more capable defensive capabilities that we have that rely specifically on radars, communications in that area?
Generally speaking, yes, but I am not a technical expert.
Okay. Fair to say that the Aegis destroyer systems that we rely on for protecting against air attacks along our coastlines utilize, I think publicly we've talked about it already, about the fact that our radars are in that region?
I think that's fair.
Okay. Not just the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States, but Alaska and Hawaii as well?
Yes.
We spend a lot of money specifically in that particular area. Our adversaries know that. It's a matter of public discussion. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
Right now, there is public discussion about sharing a large amount of that area, or a discussion about trying to share or take from the Department of Defense portions of that spectrum. Would that be an item of interest for our adversaries? And would there be an advantage to our adversaries if for any reason we were to lose that part of the spectrum for defensive purposes?
I think that would be an item of interest for our adversaries, and I could see them potentially trying to take advantage of that discussion.
Director Haynes, would you agree with that?
Yes.
Thank you. Let me turn one other, Africa. I just really curious. I know that right now China has been looking at the possibilities of bases in Africa. Along the Atlantic coast of Africa, what would happen if Africa were to be able to, or if China were to be able to establish a base of operations, or for that matter, Russia, along the Atlantic coast of Africa? What would that do in terms of defending our homeland?
Senator, I think permanent bases there would give them more reach and more access. And as I think about strategic competition, it's one of those things that we watch. And it's really DIA's job to keep an eye on that and alert the department if we see that happening.
Do you see it happening?
We do see China trying to make inroads into Africa for sure. And we know that they would like to expand their global bases.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Round. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that a response from the Congressional Research Service to a letter that Senator Sullivan and I sent to them be included in the record. The Research Service provided an exhaustive report to us in response to questions we had on how China invests in national security, examining the investments, the PRC, that most contribute to the country's power and influence. I want to thank the CRS team for their work on this. This is a very informative report. I hope it can appear in the committee's records.
Without objection.
Thank you. Director Haynes, I want to talk about allocation of intelligence resources. Since we've been sitting here this morning, about 15 people have died in this country from drug overdoses, just in the last hour and a half. In about a week and a half, as many as were killed in September 11th. We're under attack, and yet we're not really responding. We're sort of numb to it, and particularly, we had testimony in a previous hearing that between 1% and 2% of the ISR resources globally under our control are involved in looking at the drug importation problem from south of our country. I think that's a gross misallocation of resources. If this were a terrorist attack killing 110,000 people a year, we would be turning this country upside down to counteract it. And to not be allocating the most basic, important intelligence resources of ISR in this fight, I think, is unconscionable. I hope that you will go back to the administration, particularly to the intelligence community, and say, this is a worldwide threat that is the most immediate threat to American lives. Can you make that commitment to me?
Yes, absolutely, Senator. I think you know that, and we've indicated this in other testimony, but the leaders of the intelligence community completely agree with you that this is absolutely critical, and we're each of us involved in a whole series of efforts to try to expand effectively our collection and our
I've been asking these
capacity in
questions
this space.
for years, and everybody agrees, but I keep seeing 1 or 2%. So
Insufficient.
I'm looking for action rather than simply expressions of concern. General Berrier, do we have any information that you can share in open session about Chinese provision of munitions to the Russians in the Ukraine war? Because in my view, that would change the calculus if suddenly Russia had an infusion of ammunition and other munitions in order to counteract the actions of the Ukrainians?
Senator, we watch this very, very carefully, and publicly China has said that they would remain neutral in this conflict. We continue to watch them, and we can discuss it more in the closed session if that's okay.
Thank you. You mentioned in your testimony, and I noticed there's a little subtlety where you said this has been a bad year for Russia and Ukraine, but then I think in the next phrase you said, but Russia is very dangerous. What's the analysis of the likelihood of Putin using nuclear weapons? What would trigger it, and how likely is it?
Senator, there are a number of scenarios that we've thought through, and I'd be happy to discuss those in a closed session.
Well, I think in an open session, though, can you tell me that whether you think there is some likelihood or possibility of nuclear weapons being used?
I think, you know, in the nature of conflict, there's always that possibility. Right now, I would say we think it's unlikely.
Unlikely is good. I'd rather hear not happen, but we can discuss this further in a closed session.
Can I?
Yes, go
just
ahead,
also
please.
say, I think from the IC perspective, it's very unlikely is our current assessment.
Thank you. We can discuss that further in the closed session. Director Haynes, yes or no question, would expiration of Section 702 be a major compromise of national security?
Yes.
And I think you've testified about how important it is, but I don't think it really comes across that this is one of the crown jewels of our intelligence capability, is it not?
Yes. As an example of this, 59% of every PDB, our President's Daily Brief articles, are sourced to 702 information. It gives you a sense of just how critical this is. It is utterly fundamental. I could not overstate, frankly, the value of it.
And I know you struggled with this in your opening statement, but the problem is the importance of it is hard to demonstrate to our membership without compromising classified material, and that's the dilemma. I think we have to accept your representation, which I understand you're talking for the entire intelligence community. This is an essential element of our ability to protect this country. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Ernst, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I also would like to express my condolences to the family and the friends of the late General Stewart. So good morning to our witnesses, and thanks for the testimony today. The greatest military challenge that we face is really a two-front competition, as you've laid out so well this morning, between China and Russia. So I do agree with your judgment that China and Russia will maintain their strategic ties, which does create potential threats. And let's be clear, we've heard you state over and over again, as we've seen China and Russia advancing, they are clearly encircling us around the globe. So China proclaimed a no-limits partnership on the eve of Russia's invasion, and she just went to Moscow and affirmed that commitment. And we watched all of that unfold on our television sets. And Director Haynes, first to you, how has Beijing's assessment of its junior partner in Moscow changed since the invasion? And then to you, General Berrier, do the recent joint military exercises suggest a deeper or deepening military commitment between the two countries?
Thank you, Senator. So in terms of how the relationship has changed, and particularly China's perception of it since the invasion of Ukraine, I will say that even before the invasion of Ukraine, we recognized that China and Russia were getting increasingly closer, and that we were seeing cooperation across all different sectors. But to your point, since the invasion, that closeness has accelerated to some extent, and in part this is due to the fact that Russia is increasingly beholden to and needs China, and China perceives Russia increasingly as, you know, a country that was already in the sort of little brother role, is often how it's described, but nevertheless is now even more beholden, and therefore they have greater leverage. And that can sort of manifest itself in the context of various aspects of the relationship, such as in the Arctic, where they actually have differing interests, where, you know, China is not an Arctic country but wants to be in effect and wants to have more power and authority in that area, and Russia recognizes that they're going to need China and their investment in order to get to some of the resources that they're interested in the Arctic, and as a consequence that you know, China sees an opportunity, and an increasing one, in light of the current scenario with Russia. And so we see them now at sort of the peak of their economic trade, continuing military exercises and other types of collaboration and political and technical, and it is moving, even as we continue to assess from an intelligence community perspective that there are limits, ultimately, that they are unlikely to get to the point of being like NATO allies, for example, as we see them.
Great, thank you. General Berrier.
Senator, I would describe it as deepening, and it's been gradual, but the complexity, the scope, and the tempo of these joint exercises is increasing, mostly in the air domain and the naval domain. We don't have a lot of insight into more sensitive activities, but I do believe that it is deepening and growing.
Thank you. And to both of you as well, with this partnership and the deepening of their military commitment through exercises and so forth, how can we find a wedge and really divide the two countries by driving a wedge between them? What can we find as a strategy to separate those two powers?
Yeah, it's a great question. We have done some analysis, and we can get you a more thorough explanation rather than my quick remarks. But I would say that we do see some challenges for them in getting, you know, as they get closer and closer. And largely, you know, one can recognize that there is a tension where there's such an asymmetry in the power of the relationship, where you can actually use that to some extent to exploit some of the challenges. But it is, you know, I think that it is unlikely that we will take them really off the trajectory of continuing to get closer in the coming years.
Senator, I believe it's a really tough problem, and it's a great question. In a closed session, there would be some things that we could discuss.
Okay, excellent. And with that, I'll yield my remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you. On behalf of the chairman, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Director Haynes, I do recognize the importance of the FISA Section 702 authorization. As you noted, 59% or so of the information given to the president daily is sourced to 702. However, Americans do have a constitutional right to not be searched without a warrant. So despite the efforts of Congress, there have been reported examples of the intelligence community using 702 to target U.S. citizens. That's not supposed to happen. So your own office's annual transparency report estimates that in 2021, the FBI conducted approximately 3.4 million queries of Section 702 acquired data on U.S. citizens. Clearly, existing safeguards are not enough. I have a series of quick questions I'd like to ask for your response, quick responses. Director Wood, imposing a warrant requirement before the government searches Section 702 acquired data for Americans' communications hamper your intelligence gathering against malign foreign actors?
Thank you, Senator. So a few things. One is 702 is an authority that is only permits the targeting of foreign persons outside of the United States.
Yes.
So, so just to be clear, if a U.S. person were to be targeted under 702, that would be unlawful, and that is something that's not compliant. When you talk about the 3.4 million searches that the FBI did, that's not where they're targeting U.S. persons. So what is happening there is there's about, it's a less than 4% of the data that is brought in from FISA that the FBI is able to search. And when they're doing searches, often what they're looking for is connections that allow them to identify victims of, for example, cyber attacks or other things like that. So they're searching through an existing database to see if there's a connection that ultimately would allow them to make that connection. And we can talk about this more in the closed session to give you greater detail. But for example, within the 3.4 million, 1.9 million was related to a particular cyber attack. So it just gives you a sense of the difference, and that's not something that that is necessarily. In other words, it's not something that's subject to a warrant, nor would it be subject to a warrant per se. But as a general matter, if we had to seek a warrant for every target of a foreign person abroad, there's no question it would have an enormous impact on our work and make it much more challenging.
Yes, but with 3.4 million inquiries based on data collected through an appropriate 702 inquiry of foreign citizens outside of the U.S., I think there are concerns. So my next question is, what would statutory limits and judicial oversight to prevent the collection and the use of Americans' communications and other Fourth Amendment protected information hamper your intelligence gathering efforts against malign foreign actors?
And make sure that I'm understanding you correctly. If you're asking us what are additional reforms that we would be willing to make, we are absolutely open to considering reforms. The Attorney General and myself wrote a letter to Congress letting you know that that is something we would be happy to discuss. We have. I mentioned that we've engaged in a number of reforms in the last few years to try to promote additional oversight, and we'd be happy to talk about whether or not those should be.
I am running out of time, so there are concerns about limiting the permissible pool of Section 702 targets and also perhaps removing barriers to existing judicial review. So yes, I look forward to working with you. You did mention in your testimony that you have the Foreign Malign Influence Center, and you noted that China, Russia, and Iran may be doing things that will interfere with our upcoming elections. Can you just give us an example of the kinds of tools that we'd use, and then how do you alert our elections officials to this kind of interference?
Yeah, absolutely. And we do and did relatively recently an intelligence community assessment on election influence and interference. There is a version of it that is unclassified that we can, that we've made public as well. The kinds of things that we look at are, in fact, efforts by adversaries, including Russia, obviously, engaging in information campaigns or in other types of disinformation work to try to undermine, for example, candidates or positions or things along those lines. And we absolutely do share that information both with the Department of Homeland Security, with FBI, and they tend to be the ones to make the connection directly to the election officials within the United States. And there's a fairly robust, sort of network that has been developed in order to provide this kind of information.
Thank you. General, thank you very much for your 39 years of service. I did have some questions for you that I'll submit for the record. I call on Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Thank you both for being here and for your service. I had to step out for a while to take a phone call from a reporter in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And the reason for the question was, as you know, the administration yesterday announced an expansion of scrutiny over land purchases around military bases. They added, I think, 8 or 9 bases in states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Texas, Iowa, to the 100-mile radius for as a highly sensitive base. In other words, giving CFIUS jurisdiction within 100 miles of these bases. One of them is the Grand Forks Air Force Base, another one the Minot Air Force Base. You may recall we had quite a year last year dealing with a Chinese purchase of some land near Grand Forks for a wet corn mill facility. Anyway, all of that, finally the Air Force said, bad idea, let's not do it. CFIUS didn't have jurisdiction because it was only 12 miles from the base. I ask, my question isn't to comment specifically on Grand Forks and CFIUS, but rather, is there an increased intelligence involvement or scrutiny of land purchases by foreign entities, particularly adversarial foreign entities?
Yes is the simple answer, in the sense that over the last many years now, just as a broader context, and I suspect you already know this, but basically, as we have enacted tools such as CFIUS, for example, using the Chinese as an example, they have figured out ways to get around some of these issues in order to still try to achieve the results that they're looking to achieve. And we have seen, you know, in the mechanisms that on a bipartisan basis administrations have enacted, I think expanding from the CFIUS statute, for example, to an executive order that allows for the review of transactions where telecom companies, for example, are purchasing land and then selling, you know, telecom services to U.S. citizens, where that information may be then taken and misused. So there's a variety of examples, I think, of scenarios in which that issue at least has come up. That's helpful.
Well said. I appreciate it. General, anything you'd want to add to the?
Clearly a counterintelligence threat, Senator. You laid that out, and in the purview of the DOJ and the FBI here in CONUS. But from a foreign perspective, we see this behavior and activity in other countries around the world. Clearly a huge counterintelligence threat.
Great, thank you. With regard, I want to comment on Senator King's questions about ISR and the 1% to 2% dedicated to specifically to drug trafficking. Is that simply a prioritization issue, or do we just need more capacity to do really good ISR? Because I want to be fair that 1% to 2% isn't very much, but do we have enough in general to cover all of the things that you have to watch?
Senator, every combatant commander that speaks before this committee will say the same thing, that they don't have enough ISR. I think it's a capacity issue. Certainly, technology can help, advances in space and other sorts of sensing capabilities. But it's a really difficult conversation with our Southcom partners on how bad this problem is.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I suspected as much, and you're right. It is unanimous among the combatant commanders. So, Director Haynes, I'm going to really shift gears here a little bit, because we're talking about worldwide threats, and it's easy to talk about the big ones that are obvious and always in front of us. But there are other smaller skirmishes here and there that I think may not be as significant, but still significant. I'd like your take on one in particular, and that is what's going on in Haiti. I have a number of friends that are involved in charitable work. In fact, I'm kind of stunned how many friends I have involved in charitable work, and they're just distraught about what's going on in Haiti. Now, Haiti, you know, I'll tell you where it is in its proximity, and maybe you could just tell me a little bit about what you were seeing in Haiti, to the degree you're able to tell me what you think, what's being done and what can be done. And these are policy questions, I understand that, but I think we need to engage a little bit and not just let it fall, because for obvious reasons. Maybe you just expand in the last 30 seconds of my time on that.
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't agree more with the fact that this is a really vexing issue and one that should be focused on. And you know, I can tell you that from an intelligence community perspective, we have been looking to try to find ways to support, in effect, what I understand the policy community is looking at, which is a multinational force that would try to address the situation, both from the perspective of training police and also to sort of try to manage the violence that has erupted and the gang control of territory in this area. And I will say briefly that, first of all, we have a lot of analytic products. I'm happy to provide you what I think is the best that we have on this, but it is, none of it is optimistic, which is to say that this is a really challenging situation, and it does not look as if it is going to get better anytime soon.
So, if I might, General, I mean, are there security concerns in addition to just the moral and ethical concerns?
I think there are security concerns and moral and ethical concerns. When I look at it, it's sort of the loss of credibility in the government and government institutions, their ability to provide services, a terrible economy, a population at risk, and at the same time, this rise of these organized criminal elements that seem to be taking over and challenging the security forces. So really a perfect storm, and I think in our hemisphere, we are paying attention to that.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So cryptocurrency is now the method of choice for countries to evade sanctions so that they can fund weapons programs, support spying, and promote cyber attacks. Crypto crime is hidden, but we know that in 2022 alone, there was over $20 billion in illicit transactions. We also know that Russia, Iran, and North Korea moved around at least $8 billion using crypto. So let's focus for just a minute on North Korea. This one country stole a record-breaking $1.7 billion. According to the UN Security Council, North Korea uses its crypto crime to fund its nuclear weapons development. General Berrier, you lead the Defense Intelligence Agency, which collects intel on foreign militaries, including on North Korea. When North Korea launders billions of dollars worth of crypto and funnels it into its nuclear program, does that threaten our national security?
Certainly, Senator, as North Korea steals that money and then tries to turn it into a legal tender, which at great cost, as you know, that is helping them build their nuclear capacity, and that is a threat that we recognize.
Thank you. So, Director Haynes, earlier this year, the U.S. intelligence community, which you lead, put out its annual threat assessment in which you identified North Korean cryptocurrency heists as part of a, and I'm going to quote you here, sophisticated and agile espionage, cybercrime, and attack threat. So let me ask you, does a sophisticated and agile espionage, cybercrime, and attack threat undermine our national security?
Yes, absolutely. And just to pull it apart, to say that it's not just, although obviously the funding is critical, it's not just the funding of essentially nuclear programs that the DPRK may have involved in, but it's also posing a cyber threat to important networks, and that's part of what it is that we see as this national security threat.
Thank you. So let's move to another example. A 2021 study found that nearly 5% of the world's Bitcoin mining takes place in Iran. The biggest crypto mine in the country is run by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and is backed by Chinese investment. How much sanctions evasion are we talking about here? Well, one crypto exchange alone, Binance, has processed $8 billion worth of Iranian transactions since 2018. So, General Berrier, when the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps uses crypto mining to replace revenue that they lose through sanctions, does that threaten our national security?
Senator, I think it certainly threatens our U.S. forces in the region. Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, is one method of how they finance their operations, so I think it's certainly a component of that, yes.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to do get one more example in here, and that's Russia, because Russia is ransomware central. The most prolific and dangerous ransomware gangs are thought to be run by criminals in Russia. Russia-affiliated ransomware gangs have stolen from American schools, American hospitals, American power stations, and American businesses. Director Haynes, do you know what portion of ransomware is paid in crypto?
So we assess that the vast majority of modern ransomware operators demand cryptocurrency, and when those demands aren't met, they probably, are paid in that form. But part of the challenge for us in terms of identifying specifically how much is being used, is using cryptocurrency, is that we just, all ransomware incidents or payments aren't reported or documented.
Fair enough,
so we just
fair
don't
enough.
have
But
that.
when the HISGAC committee, Homeland Security Committee, put out its report, it said basically it's 100%. Does that sound about right to you? This is a business model built on crypto, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority, I think over 90% is perfectly reasonable.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, General Berrier, does the fact that ransomware gangs in Russia and around the world are using crypto to demand ransoms from American hospitals and schools and power stations and businesses, does that threaten our national security?
I believe it does, Senator, yes.
Yeah, I appreciate this. I appreciate your answers. You know, just think about what we're talking about here. North Korean nuclear weapons, Iranian sanctions, Russian ransomware, drug trafficking, human trafficking. Some of the major threats to our national security are facilitated by crypto. And that is why Senator Roger Marshall and I will soon reintroduce our bill to crack down on illicit crypto activity. Our bill is not about SEC regulation or cracking down on crypto investor scams, although I think we need to do that. Our bill is about law enforcement and national security and keeping our country safe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Scott, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thanks, both of you, for being here. She, in the last 12 months, has given a variety of speeches that he is preparing the Chinese population for war. How do you, what should we take from that? How do you, each of you, assess that?
So as we listen to Xi Jinping and his style of communication, he has been on a long-term campaign to oversee China's rise. Now that he's in his third term, we see his rhetoric picking up. I believe that there are a number of dates out there that mean different things to different people. We've talked about 2025, 2027, 2035, and 2049. I think the bottom line is he's told his military to be ready for what we are not sure, when we are not sure. DI watches this very, very closely, and we evaluate closely every word that he says and where he goes in his speeches.
Thank you. Just to add, but certainly agree with everything that General Berrier said, I think we continue to assess that he would prefer to achieve unification of Taiwan through peaceful means, but the reality is that he is and has directed his military to provide him with the military option, essentially, to be able to take it without concern of our intervention. And that is something that will have a meaningful impact on his capacity to do so and also his decision-making, presumably.
Have you, do you assess the position the American economy would be in with our dependence on Communist China if they did decide to invade Taiwan and we decided to come to Taiwan's aid? What impact would that have on our economy?
Yeah, so it's not, obviously we can't provide precision because the scenario will matter when it happens. All of those kinds of things would be critical to actually providing an assessment. But it is without question, and there have been studies done by external think tanks and others on the impact, the economic impact that an invasion of Taiwan would have on the global financial economy. I will say that because TSMC, the manufacturer of semiconductor chips on Taiwan, if that is blocked, it will have an enormous global financial impact that I think runs somewhere between $600 billion to over $1 trillion on an annual basis for the first several years on the global financial economy is the general estimate. Because those chips, those advanced chips are in over 90%, come from Taiwan, and they're in almost every category of electronic device around the world. And so therefore, until we would be able to sort of make up the difference, it would have this enormous impact. It will also have an impact on our GDP if there were such an invasion of Taiwan and that was blocked. It would also have an impact if they stopped making chips on China's economy. And I think that's another aspect of this, and in fact, a more significant impact on their GDP if they were unable to get those.
You would add anything?
Just that I think watching the impact that, the economic impact on Russia as they've invaded Ukraine with the sanctions, not an exact comparison, maybe apples and oranges, but I think it gives us an idea of how to model this when it happens, or if it happens.
What's your assessment of risk in Latin America? Senator Kramer talked about Haiti, but we know Cuba is a state sponsor of terrorism, and they've allowed our adversaries to be in Cuba. Maduro's doing the exact same thing in Venezuela. So what's your assessment of the risk of bad actors being in Latin America, and what's the risk that Communist China is going to be able to open up military bases in Latin America?
For the time being, I would say the risk is moderate. We do see Chinese and Russian actors in Central and South America, something that we watch very, very carefully. We have a consistent messaging campaign through our defense attaché network in Central and South America to talk about why this is a bad deal for them. We watch it carefully. I don't think they're very, very close to acquiring full-up operational bases in Central or South America right now.
Anything you want to add? All right. What's your assessment of the commitment that Germany has to make sure that they'll do everything under their power to make sure Ukraine succeeds in the war against Russia?
I think, honestly, that Germany has exceeded our analysts' expectations prior to the war, for example, in terms of its commitment to providing support to Ukraine, and we've seen them be actually a stalwart ally on this issue, and yeah, moving forward.
Nothing to add on that.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you for your testimony here today and for your service to our country. Director Haynes, the proliferation of cameras, commercial satellite imagery, and social media have helped create an environment where open source intelligence is often one step behind, but is sometimes a step ahead from traditional intelligence gathering efforts. The buildup of Russian forces as they prepared to invade Ukraine was well documented, with both domestic and foreign observers able to confirm troop and vehicle movements, even identify entire units who were moving to the front. I was also taken by an article by the Modern War Institute at West Point, talked and some quotes from some intelligence operators. They were talking about, of course, the intense need for intelligence as this war was progressing. And in this saying, quote, "We were collecting only a fraction of what was needed." This was not a surprise. With the largest war in Europe since World War II occurring, intelligence capabilities were in high demand. This did not, however, diminish the frustration of walking out of the skiff, turning on our phones, and gaining access to more and more relevant open source content than we had actually at our workstations. Open source intelligence has uncovered fields of Chinese nuclear silos, new PRC shipyard activity, the buildup of PRC troops along the front in India. In short, open source intelligence seems to be democratizing the intelligence field, and I want to make sure that we're adequately prepared to harness this activity. So my question for you, and General, if you have comments on this too, is what changes must the IC community make to ensure that the United States is maintaining a strategic advantage in espionage and intelligence gathering, particularly as these new technologies are coming on board and are democratized and our adversaries and others have access to this information as well? How are we thinking this problem set through?
Yeah, it's a multidimensional issue, right? You know, and this is something that has been a big focus, and I know General Berrier will have a lot to say because the Defense Intelligence Agency does a lot in the open source sort of space for the intelligence community. But first of all, we are in a position where really every element has a version of open source that they are working on. However, we are not in a position where we feel as if the entire intelligence community is leveraging sort of the best of what we can do in this space yet, and that is something that we've been focused on. We've done a study to look at how we can improve our efforts, how we can leverage each other's efforts in the space, and you'll hear from General Berrier about what DIA does, but also how we can invest in it in a way that supports essentially what we collect clandestinely and, you know, allow us to bring together the two sources of information so that we can provide a complete picture that is more insightful than what you might get from open source. But at the same time, to recognize that there's value in actually using open source to help to reveal a picture of what's happening in different places and share that with the world. At the same time, on the flip side, and just mention two things that I think are worth noting, is that we are very conscious of the fact that in this area we have to be extremely careful about how we approach privacy and civil liberties issues. And one of the issues that we know has been of concern for many members of Congress is how we deal with, for example, commercially available information that is for example, information that we may purchase as part of our efforts to engage in open source, and trying to make sure that we are developing sophisticated policies and frameworks to ensure that we are handling that information appropriately, and when we collect it, collecting it appropriately in these spaces. And finally, recognizing that spyware and our adversaries' access to open source information also makes them far more sophisticated in their capacity to target and to, from a counterintelligence perspective, affect us. And that's something we're also looking to try to manage and to counter appropriately.
Thank you. Limited time, General, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Just briefly, Senator, I think open source is kind of the new frontier for the intelligence community, but it's also a bit of a wild, wild west. And so in my role as the intelligence enterprise manager for the Department of Defense on open source, what I have to make sure is that the DoD entities that are doing open source collection and analysis are not getting ripped off from the data sources and how much they pay, that we have the right tools, the right training, the right tradecraft, so that we can go forward to make sure that open source and its richness augments everything that we do on the sensitive side for a more fulsome picture of what's happening out there in the world. I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you, General.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you very much. Director Haynes, what's your assessment of Iran's seizing its second oil tanker in a week in international waters?
Sir, can we take that in closed session? I think there is something to be said, but yeah.
Thank you very much. General Berrier, Southcom commander has been stating for years that Chinese influence in Central and South America is increasing, and we are at risk of losing our status as a partner of choice for many critical allies in the region. I've just spent a lot of time down in Panama. Do you agree with this assessment? If so, what impact would this loss of status have on the safety and defense of the homeland?
I do agree with General Richardson, and I believe that we should be doing everything that we can to talk to our partners and allies down in Central and South America about the value that the United States brings.
Director Haynes, you get
completely agree.
Same thing. Do we see an imminent threat in that area?
Not an imminent military threat, but I think there is a reputational threat. There is a economic threat because they bring resources quickly. And I think we have to be insightful in thinking through how we beat that.
All right, Director Haynes, I'm concerned about. We're all concerned about the rising threat of terrorism, especially since the debacle in Afghanistan. In March, General Kurilla told this committee that, in his estimation, ISIS-K could do an external operation against the U.S. or Western interest abroad in under 6 months with little or no warning. Do you agree with this assessment?
Yes, one of your colleagues raised this earlier. I would have to check with our analysts to see if they still agree with that. There have been some developments that we can talk about in closed session since that statement was made that I think could affect the timeline. But I agree that that ISIS-K remains intent on looking to do external attacks.
Yeah. General.
Senator, I think our line is something like 6 to 12 months. I'm not disagreeing with General Kurilla's analysis or his team down at CENTCOM. Sometimes at different points we might see it slightly different depending on where we're at and what we're looking at.
Thank you. I yield my time.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator Rosen, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here today, and good to see you here and the really thoughtful answers. I want to build a little bit on what Senator Scott was talking about in countering the rising Chinese influence. So, Director Haynes, of course, we know in recent months, China has rapidly increased its engagement around the world. It includes brokering, actually trying to broker troubling agreements between, to reestablish diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia, offering to broker peace deals between Ukraine and the Russian aggressors. So these incidents, they highlight China's persistent presence and intention to exert its influence and match the U.S. as a global power. So how can the U.S. address China's increasing involvement in global diplomatic matters? And can we expect to see more countries try to turn to China as a mediator? And what do you think the implications of this pivot would mean to us?
Thank you, Senator. It's a very thoughtful question. I think obviously, China's engaging in international fora in and of itself is not a challenge or a problem. It's how they engage and the way in which they use that engagement to actually undermine, for example, global norms and the international order in the way that we have designed it. We have spent quite a bit of time in the intelligence community trying to map out how they are approaching their engagement in international fora in order to do just that. And I would say that this is a place where we've been looking at their efforts to essentially sort of garner influence and change the direction of international organizations so as to support their particular approach to global norms, which is more aligned with an authoritarian system. And you look at organizations such as the ITU or the International Telecommunications Union and other places where I think there have been concerns about China's influence and efforts in those spaces. And that's something I know the policy community is focused on trying to manage. I think another aspect of it is, as you rightly point out, their effort to try to create coalitions. I would have to say that in that area, we've seen them have mixed success. You know, there's sort of things like the 17+1 forum and other things like that that they've tried to do where because they took quite a bullying approach to trying to get other countries to do what they wanted to do, it actually backfired to some extent on them and they weren't able to engage in as much influence as we thought. And there are yet other variations on the theme that I think are important to our work moving forward. Maybe General Berrier has more.
Yeah.
I believe China is trying to enhance its reputation on the global stage. When I look at the examples that you gave, we're a key security partner with the kingdom, and we're a key security partner with Ukraine. We also have influence, and we're in discussions with those partners every single day on really tough issues. And I think whether those are military diplomats in the Defense Attaché Service or the work that our State Department is doing, we've got a great message.
Well, I want to build on this because China's gaining a hold in the Middle East. They want to gain a hold there. And our partners in the region, they want to hedge. They may want to hedge what they could perceive as America's diminishing global engagement. So building on what you're talking about, how does the U.S., how do we reassure our allies and partners in the Middle East, but more broadly, that we will remain a force for stability and security and steadfast with them in the region.
So even though our military commitments have come down in the central region, U.S. Central Command is still very active in this area. We have a forward headquarters in Qatar. We have deployed forces there still, and it's not a large number, but they're actively there. And we have long-standing relationships with these partners, and so it's our ability to continue to communicate with them to demonstrate American resolve in the region and to bring what it is that the U.S. brings.
Director, anything? No? Yeah, we had a recent trip there, and I think that was the biggest concern from at least the Abraham Accord countries that we visited, that we would remain steadfast in the region. And speaking of the region, I only have 33 seconds left, so I will just ask this for the record, but I really want to talk about Iran and Russia, their defense cooperation, how concerned we are about the sale of Russian aircraft and air defense systems to Iran. I'll take that off the record as I only, unless you can answer in about 30 seconds, I'll just, we know what Iran is seeking from Russia.
Certainly, I think this is a relationship. The Iranians are gaining some benefit for providing munitions, UAVs and such to the Russians. We're watching it very, very carefully, and we'll see where this relationship goes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Mullen, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Haynes and General for being here. I'm just going to make a quick question about, I believe it's pronounced Wagner, but I believe the media pronounces Wagner Group all the time. I'm going to have most of these questions for the closed session. But right now we see, in my opinion, and I'd like to get yours opinion, in my opinion, Putin's using the Wagner Group to kind of do his bidding literally around the world. And in my opinion, truly my opinion, they are acting more like a terrorist organization than they are a malicious group or a contracting group when they're sowing instability, supporting groups, spreading lies, exporting critical minerals around the world, pressuring governments to distance themselves from us. Would you describe their behavior as acting more like a terrorist group, Director Haynes?
Yeah, I would absolutely support the perspective that that Wagner is actively working in ways that is actually driving terrorism, particularly in the continent of Africa, for example. And
Sure.
that's an example of what you're describing.
General?
So it's a really interesting question, and when you look at their business model, how they try to build security in nations and conduct paramilitary operations and support those nations, there are some atrocities that have been reported and committed. I don't know that I would go as far as calling them a terrorist organization right now. I'd have to.
No, I wouldn't. I'm saying acting. I was very careful in saying acting. I'm not calling them a terrorist organization. I'm saying acting more like that.
Certainly, you could draw a conclusion like that. Yes.
So, and we see their behavior as they typically go into these countries that are in disarray, and they offer to provide security for organizations. And would you agree that's kind of how they get their foot in these countries a lot of times?
Certainly, along with business opportunities to be developed.
Right. Now, I want to switch my gears real quick to China. According to some open sources, China now is controlling the inner river that runs through Argentina in South America, and is charging tariffs, taxes in the name of the PRC for goods being shipped in and out. We also see that they have influence basically in all of South America except one country. And General, you said that we're fighting back with information, but it seems like those countries are in more need of infrastructure and dollars, which is what China is investing. Are we winning or losing in South America with information technology and providing the good deeds that Oklahoma does, or not Oklahoma, but the United States does?
Well, certainly, I know that we're talking to our partners about this issue every day. Whether we're winning or losing, hard for me to judge that. I am not tracking this river in Argentina where they're collecting taxes, but I do know where there is infrastructure, ports, airfields that they can build upon, that they will take advantage of that business enterprise.
So, are you familiar with the influence that they have, the strong influence that's grown over the last 10 years in Central and South America?
Yes, I am.
Are you familiar with the only country that they are currently don't have a foothold in South America? I find it, and I'm not, General, this isn't an I got you question, because I honestly feel like you and I have been developing a friendship over the last couple of years. But I do find it somewhat concerning because that information is not hard to find, and it's not something that requires being read in on. It's concerning to me when they have such a strong influence in Central America, which is growing, but in South America, we're losing. I would say we're not too far off from losing control of the Panama Canal, too. And I believe you'd probably agree with that in some sense. If course doesn't correct pretty quick, they're going to control the main shipping lanes through there. Would you agree?
I would say that certainly requires U.S. attention for sure, yes.
And that would play right into the role of the Belt and Road Initiative, to which China is trying to get all the world dependent on.
Yes.
So is information enough, or should we be looking at this in a different strategy to correct course?
Ranging into the policy sector there, certainly the more that we can bring, the better for sure.
Well, we need that information. I think the American people need to know what threat is really knocking on our back door and why it is a threat. It's not just rhetoric. It's something that can extreme concern. I would say China is trying to fulfill what Stalin said, trying to destroy America from within. And that's slowly choking us out. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Mullen. Senator Budd, please.
Thank you, Chairman. General Director, thank you both for being here and for your service as well. I'd like to focus on the Indo-PACOM AOR for just a little bit. Director Haynes, in this year's annual threat assessment, it states expanded military postures by both India and China along their disputed border elevates the risk of armed confrontation between two nuclear powers. What do you assess as the risk of India and China's border dispute erupting into a conflict?
It's not insignificant, and this is on the line of actual control between
Correct.
The Indian and the Chinese border. As you indicate, China has been building up its infrastructure along the border and continuing to increase their presence, and we've seen eruptions at different times, but we've obviously been working with India in order to try to ensure that we're supporting them in their efforts to manage this.
Thank you. General, the buildup that the director just referred to along the line of actual control, what assistance, if any, is DIA providing to our Indian partners?
We have, through U.S. Indo-PACOM joint intelligence team there, have reached out to our Indian partners. We have a relationship with them, and we're attempting to support their needs.
Thank you. Director, just last week, the Chinese accosted a Philippine Coast Guard ship, as many of us are aware of. It appears that these are becoming more and more frequent. So are these negligent or intentional encounters, and what's the IC's assessment of the purpose of China doing this?
Yeah, we actually have some very good products on this that if you're interested, we should get to you. But this is
if you would, please.
What we've seen with China is they have expanded significantly their Coast Guard over the last many years. They have also begun to use their Coast Guard in new ways. So in other words, they've passed laws that allow them to use their Coast Guard to police, in effect, what they perceive as being their rightful waters, and to use even force under certain circumstances. And so, no, I do see this as part of a larger comprehensive effort that they've engaged in. And it is, there's sort of three different pieces to it. There's the ships that they use that are part of militia that are not actually part of the Coast Guard or the PLA, and then there's the Coast Guard, and then there's the PLA, and the relationship that they have with each of these different forces is related and sometimes intersects.
Thank you. And a question for both of you, if you would, and Director, we'll start with you. What's your assessment of the Chinese military's ability to conduct a cross-strait amphibious assault of Taiwan? And, you know, they've now effectively practiced a blockade, but are they ready for a major amphibious landing? Director first.
Senator, we can
well, Director first, and then if you're referring us to the closed session, if there's anything you can share in this setting, please do.
Yeah, I would honestly defer to General Berrier on their capacity, and probably would do it in a closed session.
Understood. Director, any comments on that?
I would just say a very, very complicated military operation. We've observed exercises where they review the points on an operation like this, and we can provide more detail in a closed session.
Thank you. And one final question for you, General. So DIA's China Military Power Report came out in 2019, so it's 4 years old now. If a new version was published today, what would the top line changes be? How has the military balance of power changed in Asia over the last 4 years?
Well, I think we'd probably start describing the advances that they've made in every domain of their military capability in the short 4 years. They've really advanced some of those capabilities. We talk about space, we talk about their expanded nuclear capacity, and we'd probably also talk about their expanded reach throughout the Indo-Pacific and some of those things that we were talking about before with like the maritime fishing police and the Coast Guard and those actions.
Thank you both again for your time and for your service, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Budd. Senator Schmidt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Haynes, I want to ask you, CBP has reported that thousands of Chinese nationals have come across the southern border, an increase of about 800%, I think is the most recent estimate. I guess the question for you is, what are some of the factors causing this?
Thank you, Senator. I don't have a full answer to that. Why don't I get you that in writing in response?
Okay. I'm not trying to trip you up here, but my hope would be that the intelligence community has some idea why we're seeing this increase.
Yes, we have done some analysis on this. I've taken a look at it. They went back to look at more questions, and I'd rather give you a full answer.
Okay, that's fair.
On that.
And so I guess I'll ask you, and if it's the same answer, I understand. But do you expect, or are you anticipating an increase in the number of Chinese nationals seeking to cross the southern border?
Yeah, I'd rather give you the full, what I've seen is that it went up and then it seems to have gone down a little bit is my recollection, and so unclear what the trajectory is, and I think we should give you something.
Okay. My concern, obviously, with Title 42 expiring, has accounted for about 50% of all the expulsions, I think. It's very concerning if this is an intentional effort by the CCP to send assets across our southern border. I think the American people deserve to know what's happening, and I don't think we do. This is a very concerning development, and it's ongoing, and we've seen it increase. And my concern is, again, giving one of the tools that's been useful in sending people back is going away, and we need to be prepared for that. I guess switching gears, and this could be for either one of you, but I'll start with you, Director Haynes. During the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, billions of dollars worth of valuable equipment were lost, or left behind, I should say, in addition, of course, to the brave servicemen who lost their lives. But just to put that in perspective, there was $48 million worth of ammunition, 80 aircraft, 23,000 Humvees, 250,000 automatic rifles, 95 drones, 42,000 pieces of sensitive military equipment, including night vision goggles. How have the Taliban utilized this? What do we know? Have they been selling this to adversaries? Where is all this equipment, and how is it being used?
Largely our understanding is that the Taliban have organized their security forces, that they have fallen in on this equipment. I haven't seen a lot of reporting that would indicate that they are selling it. I think they're trying to incorporate it into whatever security force they develop.
Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Haynes? Okay. I do want to ask about an after-action report on the withdrawal from Afghanistan that obviously was a total mess. What are your plans to provide an unclassified after-action report here? I think there are only some senators who've even been able to see it, but I think that given the nature of this, and there's been some public reporting that about what is out there that seems to just sort of blame the previous administration. I mean, I think this was one of the more disturbing failures in at least modern history. I guess, what are your plans to have sort of an accounting of this, of what went wrong, and make sure this never happens again? Or do you have plans to do that?
Not for the intelligence community. We don't have any plans to provide an unclassified after-action report on Afghanistan. I can't speak, obviously.
Okay.
For the
Well, I guess, and I'll just close with this. This is not a partisan statement. The idea that what happened in Afghanistan, the fact that the American people have not, to this point, gotten an actual thorough review of an after-action report of what went wrong and how we can make sure this never happens again is deeply concerning. And so this question isn't just for you, it's being asked of other people, and we'll continue to do that. But I just think for the memory of the men and women who were lost, all of the equipment that I mentioned, it was just a total debacle, and we've got to do better and make sure it never happens again. So I suppose we'll be working with you to figure out what information you can provide to more fully inform the American people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've been informed that Senator Sullivan is en route, and so I will take the opportunity to further ask a few questions and give him the opportunity to get here, but it won't be indefinite. One of the issues that we're facing is as I mentioned before, the proliferation of media, virtual media, and now what's approaching is the next great step, AI. do you have any concerns that AI will disrupt our life dramatically, and that there are steps that we should start contemplating now? I know the administration has announced yesterday that they're taking steps with respect to AI. In terms of the intelligence community, how are you viewing this, Director Haynes?
Yeah, thank you very much, Senator. I think you are wise to be focused on this, and that it will have disruptive impact. We've been writing some analysis to try to look at what the potential impact is on society in a variety of different realms, and obviously see some impact in intelligence activities that we'd be happy to talk to you in closed session on. But what we also recognize is that we do not yet have our hands around what the potential is, and what we've been doing in the intelligence community. There have been many elements have themselves put together task forces, experts who are looking at these issues, who are trying to understand in particular the impact of generative AI, as you've noted it. And we have been trying to facilitate groups of experts in the IC to essentially connect with those in the private sector who are on the cutting edge of some of these developments, so that we can make sure that we understand what they see as potential uses and developments in this area as well.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. Listening to the discussion about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, most of that equipment and those supplies were committed to the Afghan army, and that was a planned commitment. That was not deliberately leaving equipment behind. That was the tactical equipment for the Afghan army, which we all hoped would continue to function. Is that correct?
That was always the plan, that those Afghan corps that we stood up and trained would retain that equipment.
And that plan was developed under the Trump administration after the Doha agreements.
That is correct.
Okay. And then also in terms of, I think I agree with, obviously, that this has to be public, but we should all be aware that the Congress and this committee authorized a commission to study the entire situation in Afghanistan over the 20-year period. That commission is at work today, and it will publish its results, and those results will be available to the public. There might be some classified material, but it will be available to the public. So thank you. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this open. Appreciate the witnesses being here. D&I Haynes, I want to just follow up a little bit first quickly on the AI piece. Did you happen to read the very long and insightful piece by Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt, the Google founder and a senior MIT professor on AI? Did you read that?
I know exactly what you're talking about. It is on my pile, but I have not yet read it, so I apologize.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend take a look. I think it's such a big topic. The Economist has a whole focus on it today. There's all these great opportunities. You know, Henry Kissinger, still going at it. I think he turned 100 or he's turning 100 here very soon. Incredible mind. He brings some insights that are very chilling to the uses of AI and what it could mean, particularly on the national security front. And I think it would be good for you guys to do a deep dive on this and come back to the committee. We're all trying to figure it out. You have tech companies saying it's the best thing since sliced bread. You have other people saying it's going to doom the world. And but I think putting the tech companies fully in charge, I don't think that's a good idea either. So we really need your guys' insight, and I think it would be good if you can come back to the committee, either classified or unclass, on that topic. Take a look at that piece. So it's really well written and pretty scary, to be honest. And these aren't people who are prone to be Pollyannish.
Yeah.
Let me turn to my.
Do that.
Thank you. Let me turn to my favorite topic, energy. I always like to recount this story. It's now quite a sad story because I'm sure you know Vladimir Kara-Murza is in jail for 25 years, unjustly sentenced. I hope we can keep beating the drums to tell Putin to let him out. All he was doing was speaking the truth about democracy and freedom in Russia. Very courageous man. I was in a meeting with him a number of years ago, just me, him, and Senator John McCain, and I asked him what was the most important thing we could do to undermine the Putin regime, the kind of mafia grip that he has on his society and the danger he presents to the world. And Vladimir Karamurza looked at me and said, "It's easy, Senator, it's an easy answer. Produce more American energy. Produce more American energy." That is what Russia fears. So can you talk about two things? One is Russia's attempt to use energy as a weapon. They're pretty good at it. We've blunted it to some degree. And then two, on the flip side, I read the intel a lot about what the Chinese leadership thinks, what Xi Jinping thinks. They're very scared of American energy dominance, very scared. So could you talk about that as well? I think it's some of the products you guys have produced. And then maybe, I know you don't provide policy, but we do have this kind of element in American society, and to be honest, in the Biden administration and some of my colleagues in the Senate who are like, "Oh my God, we can't produce any more oil and gas. That's horrible, climate bomb." No offense, it's ridiculous, right? We're gonna need oil and gas for decades to come. Places like my state, Alaska, have the highest standards in the world on producing it. If we're gonna need it, we should produce it, not let Russia and Venezuela and hell, Saudi Arabia. So any thoughts on that too? And now I'm talking all energy. I love renewables, but we need oil and gas. The people close their eyes and scream climate bomb and we can't produce in Alaska. They have no idea what they're talking about, and you guys do. So please enlighten us, because, and don't be political here. I know the Biden administration, you're an independent operator. John Kerry and everybody, they go around the world, "Oh my God, quit buying American LNG." These people are idiots, and they're undermining our national security. The facts are there. China's fearful of American energy dominance. Putin wants to use energy as a weapon, and the best way to do it is Vladimir Karamurza's advice to me and John McCain: produce more American energy. That's how you undermine Putin and scare the Chinese. What are your thoughts on all of those very important topics that the media gets wrong, the far left puts its head in the sand on? We need factual analysis on this really important topic from you.
Thank you, sir. I know how passionate you are on these issues and knowledgeable. So I won't be political, that's for sure, but I also won't touch on policy.
Okay, you don't have to.
That's not my role.
That's not your role.
But I will say, absolutely, the intelligence community believes that Russia uses energy as a weapon. I know that doesn't come as a surprise to you. That's something they've continued to try to do during the course of the conflict. And in fact, as part of their calculation for invading Ukraine, one of the things that we know that they were focused on were the high energy prices for Europe and how that would affect, essentially, in their view, Europe's calculation on sanctions. They turned out to be wrong, which I'm quite glad about. But in any event, that is certainly a part of the picture, I think. From the Chinese perspective, I would tell you that an area that we have spent a lot of focus on is on actually China's efforts to try to control global supply chains that relate to clean energy production and work. And that is a place where we see them very consciously looking to try to control the global supply chains related to the critical minerals that are relevant to clean energy work, and we have some really interesting analysis on that, and happy also to provide that to you if it's useful, and maybe leave it at that, and I don't know.
Yeah, in general, if you don't mind, and sorry, Mr. Chairman, just a follow-on question that's related. We did ask in the NDAA last year our military to look at options, in the event of a conflict with China, to choke off oil and gas supplies to them. Our Navy could do that, and if you have any thoughts on that, or maybe we should talk about it in a classified setting.
I do have thoughts, Senator. To start on Russia weaponizing energy, I think they've used it as a carrot and stick, right? And so they've really made it painful for our European partners early in the war. And then they offered it to other partners, nefarious partners for nefarious reasons, to acquire more military hardware. So your comment about weaponization, I think, is really, really accurate. I don't disagree with you that China fears us about our potential for energy production's increase. I think they fear a lot of our economic power all the time. To the point in the NDAA, I think those really are in the purview of the Indo-PACOM team and their planning efforts as that proceeds, and then we can talk more in the closed session.
Good.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Sullivan. We have a vote going on for the benefit of my colleagues. I would suggest that we reconvene in SVC 217 at 12:15, giving an opportunity to reorganize a bit. And I will, at this point, adjourn the open session and we'll reconvene at 12:15. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.